Yeah, Jonathan, it's good to see you. Thank goodness you came on board very quickly. And we essentially, with Peter Hutchinson, the president of the SBNS, I spoke to him as one of the older, current, still working neurosurgeons in the UK about the 2026 centenary of the SBNS. And I said, what are you doing? And I felt we should upgrade the work by Tom King, which basically went up to my early consultant years. But then very little on the history had been done since, and perhaps a new slant on it was needed. So they were keen, I was keen to get histories from all the units. So how did all the units, current units, found, because there's a lot of interest in that. It'd be nice to get all those together for the 26th meeting. But also you were very keen to do a book on the history of neurosurgery in basically the United Kingdom and Ireland. So you've done a huge amount on this, and thank goodness, because you're much better at writing than me.
Well, it's very exciting just tracing the whole story right back to the beginning. And I think probably some of the most interesting discoveries are that if you look right at the beginning of neurosurgery, just how original it was, that Victor Horsley at the National was really working completely outside the box. I mean, he was working at a time when infection was just about under control. But the concept of opening the head was totally new, and he sort of took us into a completely new era. But in some respects, you can say he was ahead of everybody else, but he was ahead of his time. So he wasn't supported by the sort of things that now make surgery safe. You know, he didn't have blood transfusion. There was minimal control of infection, no antibiotics, and next to no instruments.
Yeah.
And so although that first era was important for us, and really we can say that we invented neurosurgery, you know, like the telephone and football. But we also were so ahead of the game that we then got into the 1920s when we've sort of upped our game and refined the way that it's done.
Although you did mention there were little predecessors to Horsley in that there was McEwen, Goodley Rickley.
Very much so, yeah.
And so they'd been pushed by the neurologists. McEwen perhaps was the most lone individual who just did it.
That's right.
And was the first really, I think Cushing highlighted the importance of McEwen and the real trigger of what we know as neurosurgery of today.
I think, as you say, the thing about Cushing is that he's the reason why we're at the Centenary, because the 1920s was the time when the refinements in neurosurgery came in, better control of blood loss, blood transfusion, slow, careful surgery rather than the sort of rather crude surgery of the Victorians. And that then meant that, as well as doing it, it actually started to become successful. Yeah. And it's interesting to see, one of the things we discovered is this great relationship with the Americans that the Brits had in the 20s and 30s when everybody went to the States to train. And if you went over and picked up Cushing's habits, slow, careful surgery, and also an academic approach to surgery, which was not really established in the Victorian era, and brought that back. That was what got us going and made things successful.
Yeah, he was certainly the giant of neurosurgery.
Definitely.
And it's interesting how war has precipitated problems as well, the trigger for emergency services. Some wonderful work done in the First World War, very tragic loss of Victor Horsley during the First World War, but Cushing again came late and really amalgamated what had been done by the surgeons into a much better practice of surgery. And of course, you got a great name from that.
And I think for us, you have to say that the First World War didn't change much, but the second was absolutely cataclysmic, because we suddenly had many more surgeons involved in operating on the brain than there ever had been before. And they were doing it with quite a high degree of success, not least because we brought in penicillin.
Mainly
and made it
debridement surgery and dealing of penetrating wounds and things. Pretty ghastly it must have been for them. And some of the stories that you unearthed have been very harrowing as well for some of the neurosurgeons.
And I think coming out of that, if you look at how we work these days, and that we're in a huge network of units, it's interesting to see how many of those came straight out of the Second World War.
I think
they had to be put there. We thought we were going to be bombed. We were in some centres, but the provision for surgery at the beginning of the war was huge, and that meant that surgeons were sent out into centres all around the UK.
That was very interesting. I think people don't perhaps appreciate that. Before, in the interwar years, people were going to the States to learn, particularly Cushing, Cairns and Jefferson, all spent time with him and were highly influenced by him. He encouraged the development of the SBNS, having founded the American Society of Neurosurgeons. So that got people going together, but there were still random sort of general surgeons doing work who were still doing general surgery, but of course the health service was very different. It was a private sort of entertainment arrangement, and so it wasn't particularly sought after to go and start operating on brains with bad results.
Yeah, indeed.
And I think that changed with the need for surgeons in wartime and from all the civilian injuries, and also the understanding that actually, although they had so many beds because they thought there were going to be vast numbers of casualties, particularly with the air change to air bombardment, it's interesting, the provision of beds was too much in many ways, but that gave the chance to develop the regional units which we see today, and that's really where they stemmed from.
Yeah,
and that was completely
there are seven
new.
of them. Seven of the units we have now that didn't exist before the war and came into being afterwards, which sort of got us into the modern era. So that's where people started to subspecialise. They took on colleagues, and they started to broaden the range of what they were doing in neurosurgery. You know, if you compare the pre-war neurosurgery, which was almost entirely Cushing-led, so it was just brain tumours, and then around the time of the war and afterwards, functional neurosurgery came in, particularly psychosurgery. That was a big thing in the war when leucotomy came in, and that steered the whole practice of neurosurgery away from just a concentration on brain tumours. The direction that we've been able to go in looking at this is partly the early years of this society, which are all there in writing of how Jefferson brought people together.
Book here. I was just looking at this.
And got them involved.
You've got the signatures of the very first meeting.
That's right.
In 1926.
And if you look at their immediate successors, so some of the early surgeons have already had biographies written about them, but what there's been less about is the generation that followed. You look at people like McKissick, who went to the States and brought back American habits, and there's a whole load of letters and records of his that have never been published before. And from the war, there are tremendous wartime records of the units that went out overseas and took neurosurgery to the front lines, and again, much of that has never been published.
They're quite inspirational, as you said, to read these stories.
I think so.
And I think for today, when we look through the history of neurosurgery, so much has happened since. But in fact, it's that determination and individualism that's perhaps marks neurosurgeons.
Very much so.
I think
so.
They tend to be a bit odd, and general surgical scene sort of sets us aside, slightly eccentric, a bit odd. But they were very...
It's had more than its fair share of mavericks, I think.
Certainly there have been a few mavericks I can think of. But inventive and dealing with very difficult problems, a difficult organ for surgeons to tackle.
Yeah, indeed.
But it's been interesting to see that flow of how things happened. But things have got very exciting as well today. There's a massive change to subspecialisation with a huge increase in consultants. For instance, when I was appointed, I think there were about 120 consultants. Now there are over 450, I think. And it's expanded greatly as a specialty, particularly in the last 20 years.
But we've got more focused, I think.
And
that's what changed. There are more of us, but we're much more subspecialised, and that's good for patients because they see somebody who's
much better for patients,
much more focused on their individual problem than the generalists that started things off.
And also, I think there was an MRI. The technologies have changed us, of course. The development of CT, Hounsfield, at Atkinson Morley's, the first scanner. I think I do remember operating with using I think it was the fourth oldest scanner at the Brook just before it had to be moved away. Yeah. But it was a sort of washing machine affair, and you could just about get the patient's head in. There was a funny clunking noise, and you get a little Polaroid picture with a blob on it. But it was amazing. And then the new scanners came in. We thought the new CTs were terrific. An MRI came in, and that absolutely transformed everything that I had seen in spinal surgery, because suddenly we weren't having to do myelograms or radiculograms, and the threshold for investigation dropped. So then you're picking up more cases, and it becomes easier. Everybody go, I just want a scan of my back. I've got backache and sciatica, and there's a disc. Today, I think neurosurgeons and specialists are going to spend a lot of their time doing what is so important in medicine, reassurance. And reassurance is treatment. So a lot of patients are going to have scans, very easily done, they're safe, but you've got to deal with the information these produce. And the information they produce is astronomical. It was inconceivable when I was a houseman.
Yeah.
I suppose for the younger ones today, it's going to be molecular genetics and artificial intelligence are going to be another
They'll certainly have an
massive sea
impact, no
change,
question.
probably.
And I think also miniaturisation, if you look at
Yeah.
the way ultrasound has gone just in 20 years I've been doing it, it was a pretty clunky tool,
big
and it's now
thing,
miniaturised to the extent that it'll be fitting into a burr hole.
Yeah.
That sort of change, I think, is going to make a huge difference to how we work. Yeah.
I suppose looking back on this project, Jonathan, I mean, I'm very keen that we try and get all the units' histories together, because I think that's useful for each individual unit, particularly if you've got guests coming to your unit, you can show them something about the background of the unit, especially as most of them still remain in the regional unit arrangement, and that hasn't changed. The number has remained remarkably stable.
I think the good thing about this is you give people a little bit of a knowledge of the roots of their unit, and from that I think you get some inspiration about where you're heading. You can see that we've been led by some originals, some pioneers, and it's good to keep that sort of spirit of innovation going, because it's extremely important for neurosurgery that we keep going in new directions. I think that's perhaps the main lesson of learning about these people, is that is to encourage our juniors that they can think out of the box, they can be original, and to make sure that they engage in the blue sky thinking and take us forward.
The history of British neurosurgery and Irish neurosurgery is something to be very proud of.
Very much so.
We, in many ways, you said, we sort of triggered it.
Certainly we did,
in Britain. It's very special. So I hope I'm very privileged to work with you, and I know that the work you've done for the book about this, rather than just the unit history, is going to be very special, and I'm really grateful for you for all the work you've done, Jonathan.
Thanks.